Welcome back. Now that we've covered research, it's time to tackle our next qualitative technique, individual depth interviews, also known as in-depth interviews or IDIs. And if you somehow found these videos through YouTube, my name is Sean Jordan. I'm a professional marketing researcher and instructor at SIUE. And this is the first part of our third lecture series for a class on qualitative research for marketing researchers. Now, in our previous lecture series, we talked about how qualitative research is a light in the darkness, helping to define and make sense of the shapes and shadows that we see off in the distance. We also talked about how there are four basic applications of qualitative research: exploration, deep dives, idea generation, and testing. In this series, we're going to talk about a technique that is widely used for all four applications, which is most commonly associated with generating data that seem like they're derived from a quantitative survey set to the high beam, which means that it's really powerful. But this method often provides so much depth and detail that the data can be overwhelming to look into and analyze. Before we get started, though, I want to tell you a story about something that happened when I was fairly new to my current role at the Research and Planning Group as the research director. Sean, you want to handle some interviews? Our company president, David Rich, asked me, and he didn't have to wait long for my enthusiastic response. We'd been conducting in-depth, hour-long interviews with consumers in a small Midwestern city, and I had been confined to the back room all day to observe and take notes. True to what I've experienced in these types of studies, once we'd completed our first few interviews, the research participants started to sound the same, and it was really getting difficult to tell them apart. While David was a great qualitative interviewer, in fact, one of the best that I've ever encountered, we were all starting to get a bit sleepy after sitting through hours and hours of interviews. So I kept thinking, at least interviewing is going to be a nice change of pace, if nothing else. So who's up next? I asked my assistant, and she was in charge of monitoring the lobby of the hotel conference center that we'd rented to conduct the research. You're never going to believe this, she told me, and she said his name. I can't repeat it, of course, because we promised this gentleman confidentiality for the study, and it was for a private organization. But what I will say is that he shared a name with a famous wizard. So for the sake of our story here, I'm going to call him Dumbledore. Not his real name, but close enough. He's sitting over there, she said, and she pointed me towards Dumbledore. And I walked over to greet him, and I noticed a few things right away about him. First of all, he was an elderly man, probably in his mid-70s. Didn't have a wizard's hat or staff or anything like that, though. Secondly, he was extremely alert and lucid with a strong handshake, and he had no trouble following my directions as I ushered him into the interview room. Finally, despite his name, he was a very serious man and not at all the sort of person you'd expect to have a name like Dumbledore. He didn't smile, he didn't make any jokes, he didn't laugh at my jokes, he didn't kid around about himself or anything else. And as I'd find out a few minutes into our warm-up questions, he was also a combat veteran and a widower as well. And both of those experiences had served to make him even more serious about his life. So my hour-long interview with Dumbledore was meant to cover healthcare options in the area, but very quickly it turned into a therapy session. Dumbledore had encountered some awful experiences with healthcare, including with the death of his wife in a hospital that was located elsewhere. As he told me about the complications he'd had in his own health and watching his wife pass away, he began to get teary-eyed. He was deeply frustrated with the system and with his health insurance and how cold and clinical things could be. He was a man who'd lived to see old age and yet who felt like getting there had been a trial, not a joy. I kept him talking, and I empathized as much as possible. Every time I'd ask a question from my guide, we'd get back to what he wanted to talk about. It was clear to me he needed a friend badly, and I was temporarily fulfilling that role. I was uncomfortable, but I found myself deeply caring about this man, and I wanted to help him and wanted to give him some chance to be heard because I could tell how frustrated he was. But all of a sudden, our company president opened the door and gave me the cut it off signal. The client was not interested in these data, and he had been sent to tell me to end the interview. But we still had 15 minutes left, so I decided to just keep things going. I gave Dumbledore the entire hour to talk, and I gave him his cash incentive on the way out, and then wished him well, and suggested a couple of ideas for him to help him with some of the problems that he'd expressed. So David was waiting for me when I returned. "Did you learn anything?" he asked. "Well, I learned that man really needs to be heard," I said. "No," David said, shaking his head. "What you should have learned from this is what losing control of an interview looks like. You should have cut him off and just let him go." Oh, I said, and I was a little bit crestfallen to hear this. I guess I just felt like he needed a friend, and I thought maybe we could get something out of that interview that we could use, but I could also, help him out. He does need a friend, David agreed. And I feel badly for him too. But we're here to be researchers, not to be social workers. And that interview that you just conducted isn't going to be of very much use to our client because it's about something that happened somewhere else, not here. I was bothered by this, and I told David that I felt our role should be to let people speak when they open up to us for research. And he nodded, but he also said, while I agree, we have to be surgeons. Careful where we're making that opening. Otherwise, every person we bring in here is going to let their guts spill out. It was an ugly analogy, but it made sense to me. And I hated that my role as a researcher was not to be the friend of those that I interviewed. And I hated that my client didn't want to hear this information. But over time, I realized that my clients weren't trying to do anything to hurt Dumbledore. They were actually trying to help him and everybody else with better service. But they needed to hear what they needed to know. His story was interesting on a personal level, but his research, it wasn't useful in this context. It wasn't going to do anything to make their service better because the stories he had to tell weren't about them. I've thought a lot about that gentleman's sense, and I've constantly reminded myself, I can help by being good at my job as an interviewer and keeping control of the discussion. But I can't let people run the show, because when I let people run the show, it only undermines the good work I'm trying to do and gets in the way of the good work my clients are trying to do in improving whatever it is that they've set out to improve through conducting these kinds of research. I share all of this because in this series, we're going to be talking about IDIs. And many people feel like IDIs are something that they ought to be able to do with little training because, interviews feel a lot like having a conversation or a meeting. Many of us interview people that we are considering to work for us, or we interview people that we're talking to in customer or client relationships. It seems like something that everybody ought to be able to do easily, right? But the truth of the matter is that there are many, many, many ways in which having someone who's not a seasoned professional conduct an interview can greatly impact the quality of your research. And sometimes you can do actual harm to your study's credibility, reliability, and validity if you're not careful. What we're going to talk about in this series really just scratches the surface of a topic that we could spend an entire seminar or semester-long class discussing in far more detail. I'm going to equip you with the basics, and I'm going to try to provoke you to think more deeply about how to be a good interviewer, but I'm also going to say that being a good interviewer requires 3 basic things. First, being a good interviewer means being a good active listener, which means dedicating yourself to listening carefully to what's being said without allowing yourself to get distracted. And a lot of times, good active listeners take notes, but they don't take detailed notes. A lot of times what that means is that they write things down that they can reference later in the interview or come back to, but they're not trying to capture what was said. And it's important to use a recording device or to have an assistant there to take notes if you're going to be a good active listener. The second thing is being able to have a calm and neutral presence while still feeling warm and human. And that's a difficult dynamic to establish because a lot of times when we're trying to follow a very structured interview process, we come off as being robots, whether we mean to or not. And if you try to excuse the robotic nature of the interview too much, you come off as seeming like you don't really trust the questions that you're asking. So finding a middle ground between being too robotic and too sympathetic is difficult, and it requires a lot of skill and a lot of experience in order to really strike that balance. And in order to get that skill and experience, you have to do the third thing, which is being willing to practice over and over as often as possible and to constantly look for ways to improve upon your style and your technique. I've been doing qualitative interviewing professionally for over a decade, and before that, I have a background in journalism and in other areas like public relations where I interviewed people all the time. I am still looking for ways to be a better interviewer. I still have weaknesses that I have to be aware of. I still have techniques that I'm trying to learn and master, and I don't think I will ever be a perfect interviewer because there's so much to learn and master that I just need to put that practice in. And so I'm constantly looking for ways to get better. And what I'm telling you as students in this class is that you're going to feel initially like this is really easy, like this is something that you could do. And what you're going to find if you go back and review your interviews is that there are many, many, many things that you could have done better. And the more you learn about this technique, the more skills that you begin to develop, the more you look for opportunities to refine what you're doing. That doesn't mean that you discard everything that you did and throw it all out. It just means that you understand that you can always be better. And interviewing is a skill that ultimately requires understanding people, which means that it's something that you have to take a lifetime to master. With that said, let's get on to the good stuff.